In the contemporary world in which we presently live, skepticism is often much more common an attitude among people than is blind trust. People can be slow to believe, very hesitant to trust, especially in regard to promises, rightly fearing that someone might just be trying to take advantage of them or trying to get their hopes up, only to disappoint them in the end. This certainly carries over into social, commercial, and political aspects of our lives for sure. But what about the religious aspects? We have only to check current statistics to see how many no longer affiliate with any religious denomination at all, or say they no longer really believe in God, to see that skepticism has certainly entered into the realm of faith, and lack of trust in faith's promises, certainly in this our day. But our tendency is to think that this is a trend particular to the times in which we are currently living, while guessing that it really wasn't so much so in ages past. But as we hear these Advent readings, in particular the Gospel, we are being shown again why certain people were asked to play an important role in the coming of an ever-promised but very long-awaited Messiah, while others would remain rather oblivious to that important event in salvation history, even though it unfolded in their very day. Yes, we see Mary, Joseph, Zechariah, and Elizabeth, who remained among those who still believed in the promises of God. Yes, they were part of a faithful remnant who still prayed and longed for the day that those promises would be fulfilled, the promise to send a Messiah, in contrast to others of their day who had largely given up all hope of ever seeing a Savior. They were certainly a minority compared to the majority for whom religion and its practice was largely just a cultural matter, more than it was about deeply held convictions and sincere faith. But that the majority were no longer really hoping for the Messiah's arrival should perhaps not really surprise us. Why? Because, as we said, Israel had been waiting centuries, and while they had long remembered how they thrived under the leadership of King David and then his son Solomon, they had also endured numerous inept, unfaithful, and even corrupt kings thereafter. They had been frequently attacked by the neighboring nations. They had even endured 70 years of exile in Babylon. And when after their return they had rebuilt their temple and restored their sacred practices, they were then invaded by the Greeks, who profaned those sacred places and tried to secularize everything. And ultimately, at the point in time where we hear the gospel account, they had ended up occupied by Rome, and they were being led by a puppet king, famously known as Herod, who was Jewish in name only, and who actually obtained and held all of his power, not from God, but from the Roman emperor. So there was much about which to be discouraged, and discouragement is always the greatest enemy of faith. But it was in the midst of that mess that an angel appeared to Mary and announced the imminent coming of the Messiah, and the role she was being invited to play in order to make that happen. And because she was faithful, because she had been waiting in hope, She was prepared to say yes, even though she could not at that moment know how that plan would actually unfold, nor appreciate the cost it would eventually exact on her in terms of hardship and grief in her life. But ultimately, Mary's faithful yes to God's plan to save the world would be the cause of her eternal blessedness beyond this world. So fast forward to today, when millions will be gathering this week to celebrate Christmas. But for the majority of them, it's merely a cultural holiday rather than an authentically religious celebration. And as people look back or they look around, they might see much that can be discouraging. Much injustice, corruption, conflict, and terrible violence in this world that causes them to question God, causes them to give up on the hope of peace, and for many to become indifferent then to their religious heritage and its traditions, or to lose their faith altogether. So today's readings, in a sense, invite us to ask ourselves, who are we in the midst of all this mess? Are we among the discouraged, and thus among those at risk of becoming numbered among people who are indifferent to their faith, or even at risk of becoming among the fallen away? Or are we solidly among the faithful remnant right here in our own day, those whose belief in God is sure, and who, in spite of all they might see and maybe even experience, have not given up hope that God's promises will be fulfilled? Each Advent, we are reminded that we are called to wait in hope for the last great act in salvation history to occur. Indeed, for that promised day when the Lord will come again in glory, and that kingdom where only His will be done will arrive in its final fullness. So on that day, there can be no more injustice or violence, no more corruption, sin, or death. Only the fullness of life lived in peace, never again to be disturbed. But Advent always reminds us that we are still waiting at this, the darkest time of the year, waiting in another form of darkness for that day of final redemption to dawn. And we have been waiting long, and often in rather upsetting or difficult circumstances, both historically and personally. It is for this reason that the Church encourages us in Advent to recognize that our lives are in many ways being lived in parallel to those who long waited for the first coming of the Messiah, and urges us to imitate that faithful remnant among them rather than to join the skeptical majority. It is in this light, then, that we can see the true purpose of the celebration of Christmas, which even among those who are faithful is not always very well understood. We are not now waiting for the birth of a baby. That is not how Christ has promised to return again. Rather, we will be commemorating His birth that occurred 2 millennia ago as a reminder that this is how God began to fulfill His promise to send a Messiah. And those who still believed in that promise were ready to recognize and receive Christ at that first coming, while many others simply were not. As at the first coming, the timing, place, and manner of the Messiah's entrance into the world caught very many by surprise, and thus left them on the outside looking in. Let us not be found among the likes of them, should Christ return even in our own day. Rather, let Christmas be what it should be for us, an annual reassurance that although likely to be at a time and in a way that people do not expect, God always keeps his promises. And like Mary and the others of the faithful remnant at that first coming, those who never give up hope that Christ will finally fulfill that remaining promise at his second coming are the ones who, like Mary, will indeed be blessed when he does. So let us take the poetic line from that ancient hymn composed by St. Thomas Aquinas to be our mantra in regard to everything Christ has said, the promises he made, the promises he will keep. It is, what God's Son has told me, take for truth I do. Truth himself speaks truly, or there's nothing true. Therefore, let us trust.